Good afternoon and welcome back to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. And Happy New Year. This is a great, I left my phone. I would take a photo right now and tweet it out to the world, but I'll make sure we get that done. Welcome back to Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm Mo Wright, Chair of the Board of Trustees and President Raymond Consultants. So glad to have all of you here with us. This is probably our most popular forum every year. It's always a packed house. And so I'm so glad that all of you have come to listen to this economic forecast. Bill has assured me that everything is good. And if it's not, you can blame him for all of that. And so he'll be joining us in just a second. Today's forum marks CMC's kickoff to 2017, the annual Blue Chip Economic Forecast. First, let's thank our sponsor and partners and all their friends represented here today. Our partner, Leadership Columbus, and the members of the 2017 class, if you'd give them a round of applause. Proud graduate of Leadership Columbus myself. And to our sponsors today, BDO, Columbus State Community College, the Robert Weiler Company, and Fifth Third. Let's thank all of our sponsors for their support today. And now, if you would please welcome Paul Weber, Senior Vice President and Director of Wealth Management Advisors at Fifth Third Bank, to introduce our speakers. Paul?
Thank you, Mo. We at Fifth Third are so proud to sponsor this event one more time. This is the fourth year we've done it. Because at Fifth Third, we believe in the quality of life in our community, because this is the place that we work, that we play, and that we raise our families. So we really enjoy Columbus, and we love what this program does here. Because we're committed also to participating in these weekly forums every Wednesday, and especially in the one that we're having today. I've always enjoyed this. Today we're going to get to hear from the head of Regionomics, Bill Lafayette, who, for those of you that have seen him in the past, he's just a brainiac. And he is human, I found out today, because he has a cold. So that was really good to know. We also have here with us Mark Williams, the excellent journalist for the Columbus Dispatch. Many of you may have read his articles over the course of the number of years in the business section. And so we really appreciate all the hard work that Mark puts into this event each and every year. And then today with us, another special guest, Ian Sheldon, who has a very long title, but he is the Anderson's Chair in Agricultural Marketing, Trade, and Policy. And that's actually the Anderson's company, the Anderson Grains Company. For those of you that don't know you may be familiar with the Anderson's General Store. This is an endowment that was given to the Ohio State University, and so he sits as the chair, but he's also part of the Ohio State University on the Department of Agriculture, Environment, and Development at the Ohio State University. So very, very busy man, and they're going to give us a little bit of an update as to what they think is going on in the Columbus market, and I believe, Mark, also what's going to happen with the world in trade. So thank you. Mark? Bill.
Well, Happy New Year, everybody. Thanks a lot for coming. And as always, my thanks to CMC for having me back. This is my 16th year as the first forum of the year, and I'm just thrilled to be here. I'm delighted to welcome Ian Sheldon, who comes from OSU's Agricultural, Environmental, and Development Economics Department, to share thoughts on the national and international economies, which he can do much better than I can. And Mark Williams of the Dispatch, who will, as always, be our moderator, and who will, I trust, throw in a few thoughts of his own. And again, I do need to apologize in advance for this, what's probably the single most inopportune head cold in the entire region, perhaps the state. So if I start hacking, please bear with me. Central Ohio had another very good year in 2016. As of now, it looks like we got just over 20,000 net new jobs. That's growth of 2% compared to the 1.7% national average and 1.3% for Ohio. I have to admit, though, that the growth that we got last year fell a little bit short of the 22,000 jobs and 2.2% growth that I was expecting this time last year. But honestly, we really have nothing at all to complain about. Based on current estimates and my own projections, we've gained around 152,000 jobs since the beginning of the expansion in 2010, and that amounts to growth of 16.7%. The U.S. is up 12%, and Ohio's up 10%. And 2017 is going to be our 7th consecutive up year. Growth's going to be a little bit slower, though, and a little bit closer to the national average. We're going to get around 16,000 net new jobs, or 1.5%. U.S. employment should grow by about 1.4%. And there, as you can imagine, is certainly a degree of uncertainty around this forecast because, as I'm sure you all know, we are in for a bit of a paradigm shift. Now, we don't know all the details of Trump's plans, and we don't know where they're going to end up. After all, in the immortal words of one of our greatest thinkers, you can't always get what you want. Hey, at least I didn't quote Bieber. The thinking at the moment seems to be that for the most part, the big trend changes are going to happen not in 2017, but later on. But if need be, I'm going to put out a mini forecast sometime this summer. I haven't done that for a number of years. I used to do it, but recently I really haven't needed to. In any case, the slower growth that I'm predicting is partially a payback for the faster growth that we got earlier in the expansion. Healthcare is a great example of that. It has been a big reason why we've outperformed for so long. Healthcare has grown much faster than average since 2002, but it was only average last year and should only be average again this year. It doesn't take a PhD in economics to figure out that above average growth cannot last forever. There are a couple other sectors that are worrisome and some definite bright spots, but I'm expecting us to get to those in the conversation that's coming up. All told, though, this really is not a bad forecast, and let me remind you that it's a forecast that many other regions would kill to have. If you've been along with me in previous years, you know that I always take some time to go beyond the immediate numbers and talk about some bigger issues. In recent years, those bigger issues have all been challenges that need our attention. Those definitely still exist, but this year let me do something different. I think that we can all agree that last year's conflicts, tragedies, and polarization made 2016 nasty, brutish, and long. So I want to focus on just a few of the many things that are going well in Central Ohio. Call this a love note to my hometown. This was really tough to put together, not because there are so few good things to talk about, but because there are so many and I have a finite amount of time. First is our population growth. When I started paying attention to the local economy in 1999, our metropolitan area was 6 counties with a population of 1.5 million and about 865,000 jobs. We're now 10 counties, more than 2 million people, and more than 1 million jobs. Because MSAs, metropolitan statistical areas, are defined based on economic interdependence, the physical growth of this one is testament to our region's growing impact. Our current 10-county MSA's population grew 340,000 between 1999 and 2015, 21%. That's half again as fast as the U.S. and 9 times faster than Ohio. The vibrant neighborhoods in our central city, which now include downtown, have helped Franklin County grow faster than both the region and the U.S. over the past decade. Franklin County now has 1.25 million residents and almost certainly passed Cuyahoga County to become Ohio's most populous county last year. This year, our metro area population is likely to pass that of the Cleveland metro. Another thing going very well is the increasing concentration and their contribution of foreign-born individuals to our region. While our concentration of foreign-born residents is still below average, this population's growth is much greater than average. These residents add diversity to our community, open new businesses, and contribute numbers and invaluable cultural knowledge to our workforce. But our most important advantage, it seems to me, is one that mostly can't be reduced to numbers. We're a community that, more than many others, cares about this place, cares about each other, and strives to make it better. We see that in our many charitable organizations and the support that they attract. We see it in the average of 175 of us who show up to these forums week after week to be engaged in and to learn more about our community. We see it in the commitment of our community and civic leaders. We see it in the innovation of our young professionals who have given us Forge Columbus and Kiva, thanks to the incredible efforts of my friend, the late Reese Nieder, Independence Day, civic hacks, startup storytellers, and so much more. But mostly we see it in individual stories. Let me finish up by telling you one. A good friend of mine who's amazingly accomplished moved out of state several years ago. He told me recently, though, that he wants to come back. He wants to give back to the community and the state that has given him everything. This is a great sentiment, but it's certainly one that not many of us would find terribly unusual. But when he shared this goal with a public official in an East Coast state, she was absolutely floored. She had never heard of such a thing. Why would you do that? So my friend is going to be looking for ways to contribute professionally to Columbus and to the state. And I'm doubtless going to be asking some of you to meet with him. And I'm sure you will, because that's just the kind of community that we are. So thank you for listening. Much happiness and success in 2017. And Mark, we are in your hands.
My thanks to the Metropolitan Club for, again, allowing me to be a part of Bill's presentation. This has always been a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to our discussion that we're going to have coming up. And it's great to have Ian this year. He's going to have some really cool stuff that you all are going to be interested in hearing. I will take note that this is Bill's officially his 18th economic forecast, and I would say for the most part he's been pretty good. I think we can call this like an 18-game winning streak. It's not quite the Blue Jackets, but it's pretty good.
I am certainly not quite the Blue Jackets.
Okay, gentlemen, let's get to it. First, I want to talk briefly about Bill's forecast, just a couple questions, and then get into some conversation about the state economy. And then finally, I think the thing that is on the mind of most of you, what the heck is going to happen in 2017 with our new president? And so, Bill, your forecast shows more jobs in 2017. That's continued great news, but a little slower than what we've been used to. Anything to worry about?
Well, I think there are a few sectors that I am kind of worried about. As I said earlier, healthcare is definitely slowing down. It's still growing, but it's growing more reasonably, I would argue. manufacturing is going to slow down. And that is a nationwide trend. It's one that's definitely facing Ohio. And that's part of the reason, certainly, why we're seeing the budget shortfalls that we're seeing. The upward trend in employment and manufacturing has reversed nationally. It's showing signs of reversing statewide. It has not yet reversed locally, but that's coming. The thing to remember, though, is that this is manufacturing employment. It is not manufacturing. Manufacturing is actually doing fairly well. A big worry is retail. Retail's been underperforming for the entire expansion. Net growth from January 2010 through June 2016 was 5.1% compared to 10.8% nationally. Now, retail serves a local market, so its employment can only be as high as is justified by population. And if you remember, I've done a little bit of head scratching about why this is happening, because we normally expect retail to run into trouble when its share of employment gets too high. That hasn't happened. But if you drill down, what you do see is that there were industries that were a touch high in terms of concentration in 2010. Electronics and appliance stores, health and personal care stores, miscellaneous store retailers. Those have paid the price. But meanwhile, there are other segments of retail that are going gangbusters. Auto dealers, furniture stores, building material stores, gas stations. The big culprit, though, is non-store retailers, specifically electronic shopping and mail order houses. That segment's grown 23% nationally, less than 2% locally. If it alone had grown at an average rate, so would have total retail. It's likely that the new Amazon jobs that we're seeing are going to get classified in this segment, and if they do, the problem goes away.
So let's switch to the state economy for a second. We've seen a number of indicators that suggest that the Ohio economy is starting to struggle. Job growth, which Bill notes in his forecast, has trailed the U.S. economy since the recession ended and is getting slower. Job growth in our all-important manufacturing sector, as Bill noted, has basically come to a halt. And Governor Kasich has said that the state is starting to see weakness in the tax revenue that state collects. He hasn't said specifically that the state is going into a recession, but in a recent story I wrote, he said, quote, "I'm concerned about the slowdown. I don't want to be crying wolf, but we have to be careful." Frankly, you can make an argument that many of Ohio's metro areas have been in a sort of a permanent recession since the 1990s. Outside of Columbus, as Bill noted in a lot of his remarks, many metros and counties have had weak job growth and they're losing population. This was something new for me that I just learned in a story we had last week. Nearly 90% of our public school districts are losing students in the state. Bill and Ian, if I can get you involved in this conversation, what can you kind of get a read on how we're doing in the state with our economy?
Well, the economy is in some ways doing okay, but in terms of employment is really not. And there are a couple reasons for that. The first reason, as I said, was manufacturing. The second reason is our very, very slow population growth. If you pull Central Ohio out of Ohio, there was a population decline of, I want to say, 86,000 or so over the last half decade. And that impacts a lot of segments of the economy that cater to a local market, like retail, like personal services, like some business services. If your market isn't growing, neither can these industries. And so between the two of those things going on, I think that we've got some big problems. I do an article every other month for Hannah News Service on some aspect of the Ohio economy. And I've broken the state into 13 regions simply because it doesn't make any sense to talk about a statewide economy because there isn't one. There are only 2 regions in the state that are doing halfway decently. The one is Central Ohio. The other, believe it or not, is what I call East North Central Ohio, which is basically Amish country. Other than those 2 areas, every other region of the state is underperforming. That's a problem. It's a problem for us.
Okay, now, the moment you've all been waiting for. I want to talk about our new president, and we know what the campaign was built on. Donald Trump won to a large degree by his appeal to working class people who've been left behind economically. The president-elect has blamed our trade deals with hurting average Americans and has promised to redo them. He has promised to build a wall along the Mexican border. He has promised to label China a currency manipulator. He wants to put a tax on imported goods. On Twitter this week, he charged that GM is sending Mexican-made models of the Chevy Cruze, a model that's actually made here in Ohio, to U.S. car dealerships from across border, made in USA or pay a border tax. Ian, I'm curious about your thoughts on this. If he goes ahead with his plans, what does this mean to the U.S. economy? What does it mean to the Ohio economy? Will it help or actually do more damage to an economy that really hasn't been growing all that greatly to begin with? And what about for everybody here in this room that has to go and buy stuff at the store? What does that mean for us?
Well, having just gone through the Brexit debate 6 months ago, and now as an economist sitting up here thinking about Trump, maybe for once I'm actually going to have plenty of things to say. I'm a trade economist by background. Now, 6 months ago, I would have said, I'm not sure I'd take his positions on trade very seriously. I think this is political rhetoric for the election. But with his appointment of Peter Navarro, who is, by the way, he's an economist way out at the bottom end of the distribution in terms of people actually pushing the kinds of policies that Trump is pushing on trade. And his appointment, I think yesterday, to the position of U.S. Trade Representative says that he's of somebody who's a very strong protectionist and has been a trade lawyer for a number of years. I think he's going to be pretty serious about these things. So if Trump were to implement a 45% tariff against the Chinese across the board, as opposed to maybe pushing harder on specific cases like the steel industry for dumping, for example, the Chinese steel industry for dumping in world markets, and if he puts a 35% tariff against imports from Mexico, he's going to put the economy into recession if the Chinese and the Mexicans retaliate, as I would expect them to do. There's not going to be enough time for them to push a case as a dispute at the WTO, because this is not a single industry issue. If it's an across-the-board tariff increase, this is in violation of the U.S.'s obligations under the World Trade Organization, commitments it's been making in the complete post-war period. They will retaliate with across-the-board tariffs. And I think if I believe that the Peterson Institute numbers, if you follow these things, the Peterson Institute is an independent research institute based in Washington, D.C. These are the numbers that have been quoted in The Economist, the Financial Times, the New York Times. I think even the Columbus Dispatch quoted these numbers. We would face a recession with probably a reduction in U.S. jobs by about 4.8 to 5 million if that trade war went ahead. And those are bottom line estimates. Those estimates exclude the possibility that the U.S. would withdraw from all free trade agreements. That would include NAFTA and the other 19 free trade agreements that we have, and would remove and leave the WTO. And who knows where our tariffs would go back to if we were to leave the WTO. It ignores the possibility, and there's a lot of discussion going on about this right now, that the global supply chains, where some of their production is based in countries like China and Mexico, multinational firms, and the Chinese have talked about this, would simply relocate their assembly plants to countries like Vietnam, and China's even looking at Africa right now. So we don't know what will happen to those global supply chains, but I think they'll try to find a way around the tariff barriers. And thirdly, it ignores the huge increase in uncertainty that slapping those kinds of tariffs in place would do. And I simply don't believe it's going to bring back the numbers of jobs that Trump suggests. I think that's most unlikely.
Yeah, talk a little bit about that, Ian, because we hear so much about how much manufacturing jobs we have lost in the past number of years, and it was a big part of the campaign. What kind of give us a story on terms of what is that from trade? How much of the jobs lost are tied to that versus other factors?
Sure. The evidence out there suggests that from the late 1990s to about 2011, where we've done the research, the U.S. economy has had what's called the manufacturing sector has suffered an employment lag, and the U.S. has lost from the manufacturing sector about 5.8 million jobs. And if you believe the rhetoric during the election, you would have been led to believe that all that job loss in manufacturing was due to international trade. It turns out, if you do the numbers, that these are not my numbers, by the way. This is a reputable study out of Ball State University that gets pretty heavily cited by economics columnists. About 80% of that job loss was due to technological change. So this is, implementation of robotics in factories, etc. About 10% of that is due to international trade, and those are not unusual numbers. We would normally expect trade to impact loss of jobs by about 5 to 8% of the job churn that we observe in the U.S. economy in any given year. And the other 8 to 10% would be productivity effects. So trade is not the major culprit. It never has been considered the major culprit, and it's mostly been due to technological change.
So we're already running out of time, so I want to get to this topic briefly and then get into a final topic before we start taking questions. The Trump campaign, though, has advertised or promoted the notion of corporate tax cuts, individual tax cuts, repatriation of money that foreign companies or our U.S. multinationals have stored overseas, and an assortment of other relief programs, infrastructure build-outs and all that are meant to increase our U.S. economy. Are these the kinds of things that would stimulate our economy enough to maybe even offset some of the things that you're maybe even talking about with trade?
Well, it's certainly the case that we're ticking along at about 2.5% GDP growth here in the U.S. for 2017. I think that's probably a little bit higher than you were forecasting, Bill, though those are the IMF numbers. The IMF actually hasn't put out its regular update because I think there's so much uncertainty about what's going to happen with U.S. economic policy. Now, I think that the stock market is certainly recognizing that if we have infrastructure spending, reduction in taxes, and some of these other policies, that we probably would see a boost to economic growth. I don't think we can get growth up to 4%. I think sluggish productivity and demography simply militates against that. So I think the stock market has pretty much already priced in this good news that there's going to be a stimulus to the economy. The downside is how we're going to pay for it. We're going to get a $550 billion stimulus on infrastructure, but we're going to get potentially a larger tax cut than we observed even under the Reagan tax cuts when Reagan first came to power. I think his tax cuts accounted for 3% of GDP. The Trump proposed tax cuts, assuming they get through Congress, are larger at about 4% of GDP. Of course, the downside to that is that this is likely to be inflationary. And so we're expecting the Fed to push up the overnight rate at least 3 more times this year, with a target rate of inflation of 2%. But we're also observing that the bond markets are reacting. So when when there's an expectation of inflation and the possibility that you have to underwrite increased public spending with lower tax revenues, with more issues of U.S. government bonds, the price tends to go down, but the yield goes up because it's riskier. And so I think we're going to see, maybe not in 2017, but out into the future, an increase in the what we call the term structure. That's short-run interest rates right up through to 20-year treasuries. And then that's going to bleed into the private sector with increased borrowing costs for mortgages, car loans, et cetera. I think the thing that a lot of people haven't maybe thought through is that if U.S. interest rates go up, and this happened under the Reagan administration, the dollar will go up. The dollar's already very strong. The dollar will get stronger. That will lead to an influx of foreign funds into the U.S. That's going to put even more pressure on the trade deficit. So you're going to get this sort of unusual, this unintended consequence of growth stimulus at the same time that Trump wants to solve the trade deficit is actually going to worsen the trade deficit, in not just my opinion, but most mainstream macroeconomists.
Okay, one more question for both you guys quickly, and then we'll get into the Q&A. No doubt our economy here in Central Ohio is stronger. Our unemployment rate is low, and companies, we hear routinely in our desk that companies can't find workers. But that's only part of the story. We know that jobs have disappeared, and wages for many people have been flat or have dropped going back a generation. Millions of workers have dropped out of the labor force. A recent Bloomberg story noted that pay for men between the ages of 55 and 64 in the Midwest is basically below where it was in 1979. Another Bloomberg story noted that Social Security disability benefits have skyrocketed in parts of the country where local jobs have all but disappeared. That includes parts of southern Ohio. And despite our success here in Central Ohio, our poverty rate remains high. I correspond regularly with one reader who says there are too many incentives for staying home and not going to work. We eliminate those, according to him, and people will go out and seek work. But it's more complicated than that. What can we do to help people who are struggling and are being left behind as the economy changes?
Well, I think that the biggest single thing we can do is to basically install a Marshall Plan for training and education. That's going to help simply because workers are paid on the basis of their productivity, the value of their output. And if their productivity improves, so should their wages. The problem, though, is that training is not the silver bullet that some people think it is. Sure, you can give somebody the most gold-plated training program in the world, but if they've got kids at home, they've got a car that doesn't work, they can't get to a job. And so you have to address these other kinds of societal problems too. There's another problem that actually makes me partially agree with your reader, and that's the idea of what are called benefit cliffs. What happens is that you get child care benefits, you get educational benefits, you get all kinds of other benefits, food stamps and things like that. Those go away if you make a certain amount of money. And so there is the possibility that if you take $1 more per hour, then you lose thousands and thousands of dollars in child care. And it is economically irrational for you to do that because the child care benefit is worth more than the money that you would make in addition to what you're making now, at least in the short run. So benefit cliffs are something that we really need to take a hard look at. And I've heard that the state is doing exactly that, and I'm really happy to hear that.
Ian?
Well, two things. I agree with Bill on investing in education and the ability of people to invest in their own human capital. A gentleman down here is from Columbus State, and this is a heresy to my big boss over there, Bruce McFerrin, I think a lot more money should be targeted at two-year community colleges. I think the Germans got this right, investing in apprenticeships and skills for the 21st century. The U.S. economy is not going to return to being a manufacturing economy. The U.S. economy is going to, its comparative advantage, to use the economics jargon, is in the services sector. If you look at the data on what would be the benefits of the Trans-Pacific Partnership if we were to actually ratify the agreement, which I don't think we will, there would be a huge boost to the U.S. services sector. And folks who work in the services sector tend to be, and by services, I'm not just talking about McDonald's or basic retail, we're talking about R&D, computer services, et cetera. These are generally relatively well-paid jobs with relatively well-educated workers. That's where I think the future of the U.S. economy lies. So I think that's a good medium to long-term solution. The thing that I think's brought trade economists up short is we've always understood that trade is a positive-sum game in the sense that the beneficiaries outweigh the losers.
Well, and Ian, before you go on with that point, it's just one quick note about one reason why we've started going to these trade deals since basically World War II as a means to help bring countries closer together to kind of avoid the thing we had in World War II.
Well, I guess coming from Europe, although coming from a country that apparently doesn't want to be in the European Union anymore, I've just stopped reading the stories on the Guardian newspaper about Brexit because my head can only explode so many times. You know, the history, a lot of my students, when I asked them, do you know why the European Economic Community, which was the forerunner of the EU, was brought into place? Well, the founding fathers of the European Economic Community decided that if we brought together, particularly if you tied Germany and France together economically, there would never be a reason for them to go to war again, having been to war actually 3 times if you count for Bismarck defeating the French at the Battle of Sedan in the 19th century. So, but I think it's a stretch to argue that the only reason we've had peace in Europe and maybe globally since the 1940s is international trade and globalization is a bit of a stretch. There are other international institutions that have, of course, driven that. But I think, globalization has brought billions of people out of poverty. You just look at we attack China daily, or not we, but people attack China daily. If you look at what the Chinese economic reforms have done since the late 1970s, millions of people in China have been brought out of poverty, compared to the 1950s when millions of Chinese died through starvation in the Great Chinese Famine because of Mao's economic policies. So I think you're absolutely right that greater globalization, integration, lead to these other spillover benefits that we don't normally think about in economic discourse.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen. Now, it is, of course, the tradition of the CMC to take audience questions. Please state your name, ask your question, and, of course, we thank you in advance for not making any long editorial comments. Let's proceed with the first question.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. Thanks for being here. I'm happy to ask the first question. I'm curious if you expand a little bit, and this is probably related to what you were talking about, job training, but the reported unemployment rate, especially both urban and rural communities, in regards to what might be the real unemployment rate. If you could expand a little bit, please. Thank you.
Sure. The reported unemployment rate is very, very narrowly defined. If you are working, if you work 1 hour a week in the week that they count you in this survey, then you are in the labor force and employed. If you are not working, but if you have actively searched for employment within the last 30 days, you're in the labor force and unemployed. If neither of those two things are true, you do not exist. And so what you get is this very, very narrow definition. Essentially, you're not in the labor force or not. You are more or less in the labor force. And they had to draw a line somewhere in order to define it. There are 6 measures of unemployment. The one that we're all used to is the third most restrictive. The least restrictive counts people who have looked for a job but not recently, who are working part-time but want to work full-time and can't find a job, and a variety of other people who are simply discouraged. And that unemployment rate is around 9.4. At the worst of the recession, it was somewhere north of 17. So things really have gotten better. I kind of look at all of them. Unfortunately, you can only get those different measures of the unemployment rate for the U.S. economy. They do not exist for anything, any state or any local area.
Okay, next question.
Yes, my name is John McKnight, and I work for Rife's Auto Body, being a skilled trade. And at our place of business and at other skilled trade businesses that I'm aware of, we're having a difficult time finding enough skilled craftsmen to hire for the trade. I kind of lose sight, though, from inside the industry of whether that's because the industry is growing or skilled trades are growing, or if it's simply because there's a shortage of workers that are trained in our specific field. What is the skilled trades industry in general doing as far as jobs, and what's the outlook? Is that growing or stagnant? Thank you.
It is growing. Unfortunately, we have done a major disservice to ourselves and our economy by telling our young people that your only path to economic success is a 4-year degree. Now, when I was teaching, there were people in my class who really had no business being in college. You couldn't tell them that, though, because then they would they had no fallback position. But if you can train as a plumber and go out and make 70 or 80 or 90,000 a year, or a welder or a pipe fitter or electrician, any number of trades that pay very, very well, and not graduate with $40,000 in debt, that seems to be a pretty good deal if you're constitutionally adapted to that sort of job. I, being a klutz, am not.
Okay, next question.
Hi, I'm Warren Fishman. Bill, of course, thanks for doing this. I hate to ever miss your forum. You didn't talk much about the housing situation in Columbus. Everywhere I drive, they seem to be building housing. What do you think about the future with interest rates and rental market and housing market?
Well, the received wisdom is that interest rates are going to increase, but fairly gradually. And although 30-year fixed mortgages will be maybe a point or a point and a half more than they are now, that's still a pretty good deal. And you add to that the fact that we're going to get something between 500,000 and 1 million more people in Central Ohio between now and 2050. Over the long run, you got to be pretty bullish. But if the deficit explodes, and if interest rates tick up because inflation's ticked up more than we expect, then in the short run it could be somewhat bumpy.
Art Holmes writer has written a lot about this, and there are some neighborhoods where there's just not enough supply of houses for sale. They're just not. And in fact, in some cases, you're seeing people who've listed homes for a certain price that are getting more than that price for their home when they finally do sell it. It's really quite interesting to see what's happening and how tight the market is. And one of the things we talk about in our office is that if you sell your house, if you put your house up for sale, where are you going to go? And so that may be a situation where you decide maybe it's more rational just to stay put than go look for another house.
That's exactly what we've decided, at least for now.
One other question. I keep reading that the rental market is flourishing because of the younger generation versus the home ownership. Do you think that's going to have a long-term effect, or do you think that's really true?
I don't entirely know. This is a problem that I had to deal with in a project that I did a couple years ago, forecasting retirement wages or retirement income out 30 years. It may be that the trauma that we all went through when the housing market collapsed in the last decade has made us all think that maybe housing is riskier than we thought it was. And the finance theory tells you that if an asset's riskier, you demand less of it. But if you can shift that risk to a landlord, that might make sense.
Now, one of the things we were talking about this as well in our office, and then the economist I spoke to tells me that one day, millennials will grow up. And they will want a house, and they will want to buy a car, and some of the other things. And so whether that's true or not, I don't know, but it's interesting to talk about. So, all right, we got one more question.
Hi, my name's Trip Lazarus. I'm just wondering if you could comment on, it seems like Columbus is benefiting in a lot of ways in Ohio's loss, that maybe we're cannibalizing, people are moving here, and I'm just wondering if you see any long-term implications of, Ohio's or Central Ohio's gain being tied to some extent to other parts of Ohio's decline.
It's something I worry about a whole lot, simply because the customers of companies here are there. And if the rest of Ohio is struggling, then we fail to live up to our potential. It would be a much, much better world, and we would be doing better than we are if the rest of Ohio were doing better than it is. So we have to come up with strategies to share our success, to migrate it out further. And I'm not entirely sure what those might be, but we need to come up with something.
Let's thank this panel today. Mark Williams, Ian Sheldon, and Bill Lafayette. Wonderful conversation today. If it did not leave you with anything to look forward to, I'll tell you we do have coffee and cookies in the back. We would invite you to continue to view CMC forums on all of our public media, including Columbus Television, WOSU through PBS affiliates throughout the state, and the Ohio Channel, and always through the YouTube channel via the CMC website. Let's thank our sponsors, Fifth Third BDO, Columbus State Community College, and the Robert Weiler Company. Happy New Year again, and we'll see you again next week.